Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson is on track to be confirmed as the latest justice in the United States Supreme Court. And this is thanks to a bipartisan effort. What? Now, I don't want to give the Republican Party too much credit because, as some of you have already seen, the line of questioning that she's had to deal with, these deceptive, disgusting smears that she's had to deal with from certain members of the Republican Party have been pretty terrible. However, it turns out that 3 Republicans voted along with Democrats to advance Judge Jackson's nomination. Here's what happened. So the Senate Judiciary Committee deadlocked along party lines in an 11-11 vote Monday on whether to send Jackson's nomination to the full Senate. The tie vote forced Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer to file a discharge motion to bring the nomination before the full Senate in order to get it out of committee. And guess what? 3 Republican lawmakers, again, voted along with Democrats in order to advance her nomination. So GOP Senators Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, Mitt Romney of Utah, and Susan Collins of Maine voted with Democrats. All 3 Republicans will also support Jackson when it comes time to vote on the final confirmation, which again is likely to happen by the end of this week. Not because there's really any urgency other than the fact that Easter break is coming up, spring break is coming up for our very hardworking members of Congress. And so they would like to get this done before they go on break. Cenk.
Yeah, so it is a little encouraging to see like a ray of light in the Republican Party where 3 people still have not lost their minds. And so that's the good news. The bad news is the rest of the Republican Party still totally Looney Tunes. So the reason it got deadlocked in the committee in the first place is because Chuck Grassley joined the lunatics in the asylum. And the reason I tell you that, you probably don't even know a thing about Chuck Grassley, but the people in DC, they've been telling me for years, like over a decade, oh, don't worry about the Republicans going crazy. There's still the old timers who are moderate, wonderful, reasonable people like, and they would always say, Chuck Grassley. So where's he at? Where's he at? And where's all the idiots who push for bipartisanship and say, no, including Joe Biden, by the way. Oh no, my beloved Republican friends are gonna come around. Beloved, okay, look. On the easiest vote of all time, you only got 3 Republicans. She is eminently qualified. No one can reasonably disagree with that. That's why they had to make up the insane thing about the Josh Hawley smears that I don't want to get back into, although we're going to get back into it in a second because we're forced to, because more Republicans are speaking out against it, right? So they invented insane smears against her, and 97% of the Republican Party is all in favor of it. So while I celebrate Romney, Murkowski, and Collins doing the right thing on an incredibly simple vote, don't get it twisted. That is not the majority. That is a tiny, tiny, tiny minority of the otherwise insane Republican Party.
And look, I also want to be careful in regard to giving these 3 Republican senators too much credit because this was really a layup. Regardless of how these Republican lawmakers voted, let's just keep it real. It was very clear that Ketanji Brown Jackson would be confirmed by the Senate, simply with the Democrats and only the Democrats voting in favor of her. Manchin came out in support of Judge Jackson, so did Kyrsten Sinema. So there was really no question that she was going to be confirmed. But what do you want your legacy to be remembered as? Do you want to be one of the Republicans who decides to go on the record voting against a Supreme Court nominee who is not only qualified, but is about to make history as the court's first African-American woman? And so for Murkowski, Collins, and Romney, it was a layup. They have presented themselves, especially throughout the Trump years, and even now as the so-called moderate Republicans. I think that the press gave them way too much credit for that because more often than not, while they might have some strong statements against Trump or against the Trump era Republicans, they typically voted along with Trump and the policies that he championed. So I want to make sure that we give the audience that context because it's incredibly important. That said, earlier this week, there were stories coming out regarding Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell and how he was urging the Republican caucus to remain united in voting against Judge Jackson. And Romney, Murkowski, and Collins decided to go against the grain here. And so I guess credit where credit is due, but obviously context, full context does matter.
Yeah, it does. And important point about Mitch McConnell before we get to the prime lunatic. So McConnell said that if the Republicans had controlled the Senate, they would not have allowed Jackson to even get a hearing. Lindsey Graham said, that's it, we wouldn't allow a hearing under any circumstance because they don't care that Biden won the presidency. They just want to block him. They don't care about what's fair. Get it through your thick skulls. By the way, if you're in the audience, you all know that already. I'm mainly talking to mainstream media who are like, oh no, I can't tell who's fair and not fair. I can't tell. So Lindsey Graham says, even if the president is a Democrat for 4 years, they would never allow the president to pick a Supreme Court justice. That's obviously not what's in the Constitution. That's obviously grossly unfair. But the press, like, I can't tell. I can tell. I can tell the Republicans are cheaters. They don't believe in the Constitution, etc. But more importantly, McConnell said, look, we would have forced a more moderate pick. In other words, they would have forced Biden to pick a conservative justice. Not fully lunatic like Gorsuch or Alito, but conservative in that there was one available that conservative Democrats like Jim Clyburn pushed for. That judge was totally pro-corporations in every ruling, right? So they would have put another conservative on the court if the Republicans held the Senate. And you know Biden, he would have collapsed immediately and done that. So now the Republicans are gonna take the Senate, very likely next time around, because Biden's doing nothing to stop it. So that's it, there's no more, Trump gets 3, Biden will probably get 1 here, Judge Jackson. And that's great news, by the way, I don't want to take away from that either, right? So, but giving you full context. But when the Republicans take over, that's it. It doesn't matter that it's 2 years. They're not gonna allow any more Biden picks on the Supreme Court. So wish for the health of all the Supreme Court justices, because the playing field is so uneven. They put in a justice, well, a week or 2 weeks before the election, whereas we will not be able to get a justice 2 years before an election.
Right. I mean, McConnell is transparent about what his objectives are. And what's frustrating is the treatment is not returned in kind. You do not get the same type of treatment toward the Republican Party from Democrats. What you hear over and over again from Democrats, people like Joe Manchin, is the necessity for strong Republicans. That's how our government works. And this so-called desire to work alongside or work with Republicans with this imaginary nonsensical notion of bipartisan legislating and then rulemaking. But we all know what that really translates to. It translates to, hey, we're looking for an excuse as to why we keep empowering the Republican Party to carry out pro-corporate policies. And the reason why they do that is because they have the same donors. So while rhetorically the two parties are very different, and obviously when it comes to social issues, they're very different. When it comes to these types of bread and butter issues, when it comes to judicial nominees, they're usually in agreement for the most part in regard to pro-corporate nominees, pro-corporate judges. Look, Judge Jackson, of course, is qualified. I'm happy that she's certainly on the left compared to some of the justices that we have in the Supreme Court right now. But make no mistake, she definitely has some pro-corporate rulings in her history as well, which is why Biden would nominate her, which is why you would have 3 Republicans who would also vote in favor of advancing her nomination. That said, the initial possibility, the first potential nominee that we talked about on the show was far worse. She had a lot more blemishes on her record that were pro-corporate than Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson does. I do want to also just quickly give you a statement from Lisa Murkowski, because I thought what she had to say was interesting. I want to get your thoughts, Cenk. She said in a statement, after multiple in-depth conversations with Judge Jackson and deliberative review of her record and recent hearings, I will support her historic nomination to be an associate justice on the United States Supreme Court. My support rests on Judge Jackson's qualifications, which no one questions. her demonstrated judicial independence, her demeanor and temperament, and the important perspective she would bring to the court as a replacement for Justice Breyer. She also continues to say, it also rests on my rejection of the coercive politicizing, essentially, of the review process for Supreme Court nominees, which on both sides of the aisle is growing worse and more detached from reality by the year. While I have not and will not agree with all of Judge Jackson's decisions and opinions, her approach to cases is carefully considered and is generally well reasoned. So what I thought was the most interesting there, Cenk, was her willingness to call out just how insanely polarized Capitol Hill is, how both parties seem to be working against each other. Certainly the Republican Party, I mean, it's pretty crazy. But I just think it's easy to make that statement in this context, but I would have liked to see that kind of statement in a different context where maybe she actually ends up emboldening some of the terrible policies that are championed by someone like Donald Trump. It's just interesting that she used it in this context.
Well, so I can explain clearly where the camps are, right? So Murkowski, Romney, and Collins are in the old school corporate Republican camp, okay? And they believe in bipartisanship as long as it's helping corporate rule. And every once in a while, they'll agree to something the Democrats want, and Democrats will agree to what the Republicans want that are not strictly part of corporate rule to continue the facade of bipartisanship. Those were the old days, right? And so that's what Collins is doing here. She's saying, I don't agree with everything Judge Jackson says, but she's qualified, etc. It's very old school of her to do that, and that's good in this context, right? Now there's a second camp in American politics, and that's the right wing. And the right wing populists are now frothing at the mouth, and nothing is good enough for them. Judge Jackson is perfectly qualified, and even the other old school Republicans confess to that. And they say, oh, I don't care, she's pro-pedophilia. Looney Tunes, totally nuts, detached from reality, right? But what does Susan Collins do? Because it's the old corporate playbook, she both sides it. They're both getting detached from reality. Really? Which Democrat is detached from reality, and how? No, you're just saying that because you're a Republican and the press eats that up. Oh, yum, 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 yum. No, one side is filled with lunatics. The other side, which is still slightly dominant, but in this election, the right-wing populists might win and wipe away democracy entirely. But the dominant faction is not good either. That's corporate rule, corporate Republicans, and at least 80 to 90% of Democrats are corporate Democrats. They love corporate rule. And then you have the tiny 10% wing in the political sphere for today. In reality, the public is so much more progressive than any of these guys, and I could show it in the polling. But for now, there's about 10% of the Democratic Party that's actually populist left, right? So I would argue, and I could prove with facts, that they're the only sane ones. But for the moment being, these allies of ours, like Murkowski and Romney, that are from the corporate camp, are not, of course, in the long term, our allies at all. We have to defeat corporate rule. That's the oppression that has ruled for the last 40, 50 years, okay? But for the moment being, we need their help in defeating the fascists on the right, because otherwise there ain't gonna be a next election to argue over. So that's your full context. I'll take the vote and thank her for it, Judge Jackson. And by the way, I'll thank Biden too, because Judge Jackson overall is a very, very good judge. And I'll give Biden credit all the way to the end. This is one of the positive things he did. Thanks for watching the Young Turks, really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.